The Prussian reforms were a series of constitutional, administrative, social and economic reforms of the Kingdom of Prussia. They are sometimes known as the Stein-Hardenberg Reforms after Karl Freiherr von Stein and Karl August Fürst von Hardenberg, the main instigators. Some 19th-century historians, such as Heinrich von Treitschke, saw the reforms as the first steps towards the unification of Germany and the foundation of the German Empire. They were a reaction to the Prussian defeat by Napoleon I at Jena-Auerstedt in 1806, leading to the Second Treaty of Tilsit, in which Prussia lost about half its territory and was forced to make massive tribute payments to France. To make those payments, it needed to rationalize its administration. Prussia's defeat and subjection also demonstrated the weaknesses of its absolutist model of statehood and excluded it from among the great powers of Europe. To become a great power again, it initiated reforms from 1807 onwards, based on Enlightenment ideas and in line with reforms in other European nations. They led to the reorganization of Prussia's government and administration and changes in its agricultural trade regulations, including the abolition of serfdom and allowing peasants to become landowners. In industry, the reforms aimed to encourage competition by suppressing the monopoly of guilds. The administration was decentralized and the nobility's power reduced. There were also parallel military reforms led by Gerhard von Scharnhorst, August Neidhart von Gneisenau and Hermann von Boyen, and educational reforms headed by Wilhelm von Humboldt. Gneisenau made it clear that all these reforms were part of a single program when he stated that Prussia had to be put its foundations in the three-faced primacy of arms, knowledge and the constitution. It is harder to ascertain when the reforms ended in the fields of the constitution and internal politics in particular. The year 1819 marked a turning point, with restoration tendencies gaining the upper hand over constitutional ones. Though the reforms undoubtedly modernized Prussia, the successes were mixed, with results that were against the reformers' original wishes. The agricultural reforms freed some peasants, but the liberalization of landholding condemned many of them to poverty. The nobility saw its privileges reduced but its overall position reinforced. Reasons, aims and principles. Prussia's position in Europe in 1803, German mediatization profoundly changed the political and administrative map of Germany, favorable to mid-ranking states and to Prussia. The reorganization reinforced French influence. In 1805, the Third Coalition was formed in the hope of stopping French domination of Europe advancing further, but the coalition's armies were defeated at Austerlitz in December 1805. Triumphant, Napoleon I continued working towards dismantling the Holy Roman Empire. On 12 July 1806, he detached 16 German states from it to form the Confederation of the Rhine under French influence. On 6 August the same year, Francis II was forced to renounce his title of emperor, and the empire had to be dissolved. French influence had reached as far as the Prussian frontier by the time Frederick III of Prussia realized the situation. Encouraged by the United Kingdom, Prussia broke off its neutrality and repudiated the 1795 Peace of Basel, joining the Fourth Coalition and entering the war against France. Prussia mobilized its troops on 9 August 1806, but 2 months later was defeated at Jena-Auerstedt. Prussia was on the verge of collapse, and 3 days after the defeat Frederick William III issued posters appealing to the inhabitants of his capital Berlin to remain calm. 10 days later, Napoleon entered Berlin. The war ended on 7 July 1807 with the First Treaty of Tilsit between Napoleon and Alexander I of Russia. 2 days later, Napoleon signed a second Treaty of Tilsit with Prussia, removing half its territory and forcing Prussia's king to recognize Jerome Bonaparte as sovereign of the newly created Kingdom of Westphalia, to which Napoleon annexed the Prussian territories west of the River Elbe. Prussia had 9 million inhabitants in 1805, of which it lost 4.55 million in the treaty. It was also forced to pay 120 million francs to France in war indemnities and fund a French occupying force of 150,000 troops. Financial situation. The biting defeat of 1806 was not only the result of poor decisions and Napoleon's military genius, but also a reflection on Prussia's poor internal structures. In the 18th century, the Prussian state had been the model of enlightened despotism for the rest of Germany. To the west and south there was no single state or alliance that could challenge it. Yet in the era of Frederick II of Prussia it was a country orientated towards reform, beginning with the abolition of torture in 1740. The economic reforms of the second half of the 18th century were based on a mercantilist logic. They had to allow Prussia a certain degree of self-sufficiency and give it sufficient surpluses for export. Joseph Roven emphasizes that economic development also had to fund and support the military. Prussia's infrastructure was developed in the form of canals, roads and factories. Roads connected its outlying regions to its center. The Oder, Warta and Notek marshes were reclaimed and farmed, and apple growing was developed. However, industry remained very limited, with heavy state control. Trades were organized into monopolistic guilds, and fiscal and customs laws were complex and inefficient. After the defeat of 1806, funding the occupation force and the war indemnities put Prussia's economy under pressure. As in the 18th century, the early 19th century reforms aimed to create budgetary margins, notably in their efforts towards economic development. Administrative and legal situation. Frederick II of Prussia favored both economic and political reform. His government worked on the first codification of Prussia's laws, the 19,000-paragraph Allgemeines Landrecht für die Preußischen Staaten. Article 22 indicated that all his subjects were equal before the law. However, Frederick died in 1786, leaving the code incomplete, and was succeeded by Frederick William II of Prussia, who extended the same administrative structure and the same civil servants. The absolute system started to re-solidify under the obscurantist influence of Johann Christoph von Wallner, financial privy councillor to Frederick William II. The reforms stalled, especially in the field of modernizing society. The editing of the Allgemeines Landrecht was completed in 1792, but the French Revolution led to opposition to it, especially from the nobility. It was then withdrawn from circulation for revision and did not come back into force until 1794. Its aims included linking the state and middle-class society to the law and to civil rights, but at the same time it retained and confirmed the whole structure of the ancient regime. Serfdom, for example, was abolished in Prussia's royal domains but not in the estates of the great landowners east of the River Elbe. The nobility also held on to its position in the army and administration. In 1797 Frederick William III succeeded his father Frederick William II, but at the time of his accession he found society dominated by the old guard. Apart from the Allgemeines Landrecht promulgated in 1794, His own idea of the state was absolutist, and he considered that the state had to be in the hands of the sovereign. Before 1806, several observers and high-level civil servants such as Heinrich Friedrich Karl von Stein and Karl August von Hardenberg underlined the fact that the Prussia state needed restructuring. As Minister of Finances and the Economy, Stein put some reforms in place, such as standardizing the price of salt and partially abolishing the export-import taxes between the kingdom's territories. In April 1806, he published Darstellung der Fehlerhaften Organisation des Kabinetts und der Notwendigkeit der Bildung einer Ministerial Conference. In it, he wrote, "Start of the reforms trigger." The defeat of 1806 Prussia's war against Napoleon revealed the gaps in its state organization. Pro-war and a strong critic of his sovereign's policies, Stein was dismissed in January 1807 after the defeat by France. However, Frederick William III saw that the Prussian state and Prussian society could only survive if they began to reform. After the Treaty of Tilsit, he recalled Stein as a minister on the 10th of July 1807 with the backing of Hardenberg and Napoleon, the latter of whom saw in Stein a supporter of France. Queen Louise of Mecklenburg-Strelitz also supported Stein's reappointment. Indeed, she was more in favor of reform than her husband and was its main initiator. Aided by Stein, Hardenberg and others, she had convinced her husband to mobilize in 1806, and in 1807 she had even met with Napoleon to demand that he review the hard conditions imposed in the treaty. Hardenberg wrote the same year, Stein set certain conditions for his taking the job, among which was that the cabinet system should be abolished. In its place, ministers had to win the right to power by speaking to the king directly. After this condition had been satisfied, Stein took up his role and was thus directly responsible for the civil administration as well as exercising a controlling role over the other areas. Frederick William III still showed little inclination to engage in reforms and hesitated for a long while. The reformers thus had to expend much effort convincing the king. In this situation, it was within the bureaucracy and the army that the reformers had to fight the hardest against the nobility and the conservative and restorationist forces. The idealist philosophy of Immanuel Kant thus had a great influence on the reformers. Stein and Hardenberg each produced a treatise describing their ideas in 1807. Nassauer Denkschrift. After his recall, Stein retired to his lands in Nassau. In 1807, he published the Nassauer Denkschrift, whose main argument was the reform of the administration, in contrast to the reforms in the states of the Confederation of the Rhine. Stein's approach was traditionalist and above all anti-Enlightenment, focusing instead on critiquing absolutism. Stein followed English models such as the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and was skeptical of a centralized and militarized bureaucracy, favoring a decentralized and collegiate administration. With his collaborators, he followed a policy of defensive modernization, not with Napoleon but against him. According to Stein, the administration should be split up by field and no longer by geographical area. Thus, the administration had to be divided into two branches, the public revenue branch and the top-level state policy branch. One of the main aims of this concept was to rationalize the state financial system to raise the money to meet its war indemnities under the Treaty of Tilsit. Rationalizing the state finances would allow the state to raise revenue but limit losses due to poor administrative organization. Stein was an anti-absolutist and an anti-statist, suspicious of bureaucracy and central government. For him, civil servants were only men paid to carry out their task with indifference and a fear of innovation. Above all, he set out to decentralize and form a collegiate state. Stein thus gave more autonomy to the provinces, crests and towns. Thanks to the different posts he had previously held, Stein realized that he had to harmonize the government of the provinces. He had recourse to the old corporative constitution as he had experienced in Westphalia. The landowner, according to Stein, was the keystone to local self-government. If the landowner is excluded from all participation in the provincial administration, then the link which links him to the fatherland remains unused. However, it was not only functional considerations which played a role for Stein. He felt he first had to educate the people in politics, and provincial self-government was one of the most useful things in this area. On landowners' participation in the provincial administration, he wrote in his reform projects, Stein tried to reform a political system without losing sight of the Prussian unity shaken by the defeat of 1806. Reorganization. Stein and Hardenberg not only made a mark on later policy but also represented two different approaches to politics, with Hardenberg more steeped in Enlightenment ideas. He took the principles of the French Revolution and the suggestions created by Napoleon's practical policy on board more deeply than Stein. Hardenberg was a statist who aspired to reinforce the state through a dense and centralized administration. Nevertheless, these differences only represented a certain change of tendency among the reformers. The initiatives put in place were very much things of their own time, despite the latter umbrella concept of the Stein-Hardenberg Reforms. The Reorganization was published the same year as Stein's work and presented on the 12th of September 1807. It bore the title On the Reorganization of the Prussian State. Previously living in Riga, Hardenberg had been summoned in July by the King of Prussia under pressure from Napoleon. Hardenberg developed ideas on the overall organization of the Prussian state that were different from those of his fellow reformers. The main editors of the Reorganization were Berthold Georg Niebuhr, an expert financier, Karl von Altenstein, a future Minister of Finances, and Heinrich von Treitschke. These three men concluded that the revolution had given France a new impetus. All the sleeping forces were reawakened. The misery and weakness, the old prejudices and the shortcomings were destroyed. Thus, in the view, Prussia had to follow France's example. The authors thus favored a revolution, im guten Sinn, or in the right sense, which historians later described as revolution from above. Sovereigns and the ministers thus put in place reforms to gain all the advantages of a revolution without any of the disadvantages, such as losing the power or suffering from setbacks or outbreaks of violence. As in Stein's Denkschrift, the Reorganization favors reviving national spirit to work with the nation and the administration. Hardenberg also sought to define society's three classes: the nobility, the middle class and the peasants. To him, the peasants took part in the most numerous and most important but nevertheless the most neglected and belittled class in the state, and added that the peasant class has to become the main object of our attention. Hardenberg also sought to underline the principle of merit which he felt had to rule in society, by affirming no task in the state, without exception, is for this or that class but is open to merit and to skill and to the ability of all classes. Overview of the reforms. Within 14 months of his appointment, Stein put in place or prepared the most important reforms. The major financial crisis caused by the requirements of Tilsit forced Stein into a radical austerity policy, harnessing the state's machinery to raise the required indemnities. The success of the reforms begun by Stein was the result of a discussion already going on within the upper bureaucracy, and Stein's role in putting them in place was variable. He was almost never, for example, involved in questions of detail. Many of the reforms were drafted by others among his collaborators, such as Heinrich von Treitschke in the case of the October Decree. However, Stein was responsible for presenting the reforms to the king and to other forces opposed to them, such as the nobility. During Stein's short period of office, decisive laws were promulgated, even if the organizational law on state administration was not published until 1808. It was during Stein's time in office that the Edict of October 1807 and the city's organizational reforms of 1808 were put into effect. After a short term of office by Karl von Stein's Stein-Hardenberg regained control of policy. From 1810, he bore the title of Staatskanzler, retaining it until 1822. Thanks to him, land reform was completed via the Edicts of Regulation of 1811 and 1816 as well as the Ablöseordnung of 1821. He also pushed through the reforms of trade such as the Edict on Professional Tax of 2 November 1810 and the Law on Policing Trades of 1811. In 1818 he reformed the customs laws, abolishing internal taxes. As for social reform, the Edict of Emancipation was promulgated in 1812 for Jewish citizens. Despite the different initial situations and aims pursued, similar reforms were carried out in the states of the Confederation of the Rhine, except for the military and educational reforms. The Restoration tendencies put a stop to the reformist policy in Prussia around 1819 or 1820. Main reform fields. The reforms which were to be put in place were essentially a synthesis between historic and progressive concepts. Their aim was to replace the absolutist state structures which had become outdated. The state would have to offer its citizens the possibility of becoming involved in public affairs on the basis of personal freedom and equality before the law. The government's main policy aim was to make it possible to liberate Prussian territory from French occupation and return the kingdom to great power status through modernizing domestic policy. The Prussian subject had to become an active citizen of the state thanks to the introduction of self-government to the provinces, districts and towns. National sentiment had to be awakened as Stein foresaw in his Nassau work. But a citizen's duties were in some ways more important than his or her rights. Moreover, Stein's concept of self-government rested on a class-based society. A compromise between cooperative aspects and a modern representative system was put in place. The old divisions into the three estates of nobility, clergy and bourgeoisie were replaced by divisions into nobility, bourgeoisie and peasants. The right to vote also had to be expanded, particularly to free peasants, which would be one of the bases for the freeing of the peasants in 1807. The new organization of power in the countryside and reform of industry were factors in the liberalization of the Prussian economy. In this respect, the Prussian reforms went much further than those in the states of the Confederation of the Rhine and were much more successful. The 1806 financial crisis, intensified by the indemnities, the occupation costs and other war costs, gave the necessary impetus for these changes. In all, Prussia had to pay France 120 million francs. The freeing of the peasants, the industrial reforms and the other measures removed economic barriers and imposed free competition. The Prussian reforms relied on the economic liberalism of Adam Smith more heavily than the South German reformers. The Prussian reformers did not actively seek to encourage Prussian industry, which was then underdeveloped, but to remedy the crisis in the agricultural economy.